The previous video, you've probably got a rough idea how to connect to a database and how to use SQLite, and you probably even managed to do it relational by now. Now, obviously, there are more advanced queries you can do, which we can change, but right now, I want to show you how you can use OOP to set up a single table and how you can use OOP to build on items of inheritance and use some of those programming constructs that we've taught about. Now, obviously, I'm going to need to import SQLITE3 again to use this. But what we're going to do is we're going to start off our first class. I'm going to split this into two videos to demonstrate a number of aspects. So first of all, I'm going to have a class called my database manager. Now, the reason why I'm doing it this way is then I can build in OOP into my NEA project or any kind of database for that matter. But what I'm going to do to begin with is this line of code here will pass in the database name. Okay. Now, once I've got that, I'm going to say self.db underscore name equals db name. Self.con equals none, so there's no connection. Self.cursor equals none. Now, the next step I'm going to have is I'm going to create my connection. So there's a method called underscore connect. Now this is what will establish a connection to the SQL database, okay? So just so you understand what I'm doing here. So I'm going to use self.com, and that's where my connection is going to be. SQLITE3 connect, and then I'm going to say self.db name. This is a parameter that was passed into this class. So even if I inherit it, I'm going to always need to pass in the name of the database that I'm actually connecting to. That's why we have this here. The other thing I'm going to do now is self.cursor equals self.con.cursor. Now what that's saying now is the SQLite database name is connected, and you always have cursor as part of this because that's what sets it up to get it ready to accept the SQL. Next thing we're going to do, we're going to disconnect, all right, disconnect. We will need a method that allows us to close the database when we're not using it. So this closes the connection to the database when we're done. All right, that's what this method is used for. If self.con, so this is saying if there is a connection, so that's basically saying is if it's anything other than none, if it's not false, we're going to do self.cursor.close. You will probably have known this as connection before in our previous examples, okay? Connection object, if you remember, but because we passed it in, all right, we can use the attributes that we've created. So we've got self.cursor.close, self.con.close, and then we're going to reset that. Self.con equals none, and self.cursor equals none. So that is now our disconnection, so the database will be closed. All right. It doesn't mean that we don't need to commit our changes, though. That will happen in our query and when we fetch things. So if I go here, def, this is our query now. All right. Let me explain what is happening here. This here, okay, is using our class, but what it's going to do, in fact, I've left a parameter off. We're going to pass in our SQL, and if there are no parameters passed in, that will just be set as none. Now, if you remember in some of our previous programs, if you look back at some of the videos, when we did some of our queries, when we put in values, we put in the SQL and then parameters in brackets afterwards. So we've done that. So that is why we need these for executing the query. So this here, run the query for the program. Okay, So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to need to establish a connection. Okay. Now what this does now is it says if there are parameters self.cursor.execute. Now what goes in there, if you look here, I've got my SQL, then my parameters. It actually gives you a hint here when we're using PyScripter. So what would go in here would be SQL, and because that's what we passed in to the method, and then params. Okay, so we've got SQL and params. Else. Next here, I've passed that in. That's basically said if there were parameters passed in, I'm going to create an SQL query that uses parameters. If indeed no parameters have been passed in, we're going to go to self.cursor.execute, and what you will notice here is I only need to pass in the SQL. Where that applies, just so you can remember, is you might have had select start from table. Okay, and you'll notice I've not had to pass any parameters into that. Some of the queries that we've used, we've had a lot more parameters to pass in. But in this case, we're just going to have SQL. So we've got that set up. Now, once that has been completed, we will have self.con.commit. We're going to save it. We're going to go self.disconnect. And we are going to return self.cursor. Now, what that would do for us is that would, if you have a look here, self.cursor, whatever has been executed here will be returned. So if I run a query that did select all people in a database, that's what would be returned at this point. Okay, so that would be returning all results from the query. That's why it's there. Now, obviously, in this video, you're probably not going to see much use of that until we go into our next video. This is just setting up the initial structure. Now, the next thing we're going to do is fetch all. This is for fetching all the data. So we've got SQL again, and params equals none. So we're going to follow the same structure here. This fetches all records from the database. And again, I'm going to copy and paste these lines because they're exactly the same. This time, I am going to say result equals self.cursor.fetch all, and I'm going to disconnect and return result. Now, why is it important that I've set up the database this way? And why is it important that I've used OOP? Well, what it means is I can overwrite the behavior. I've got my structure here, but what I can do when I start creating the next class, so the class specifically for a table, is I can pass in the table name, and where I've got my SQL, I can modify the behaviors. So what I can do is I can use the structure, I can use these methods to connect and disconnect, but then I can add in my own methods for the actual student database. So if you watch me in the next video, now that we've got the structure set up for our initial database, what I can now do is inherit this, use all of these behaviors, and then add some of my own methods specifically for that table. So go on to the next video in this and you'll see how you can build upon this. At the moment, if I run this, there is nothing that is happening because I've not called on the class. So find out more in the video following on from this.